The world's most versatile air rifle, the FX Impact, just got its upgrade, and we need to talk about the M4 because this will feature as the primary hunting tool on this channel moving forward. By and large, this video is for people who are already familiar with the previous versions of the Impact or very familiar with high-end PCPs and are looking to get into that game. But I am going to take some time to give a brief history lesson on the origins of the Impact and how it's come so far over the years. If you want to skip that, I'll just put chapters down below and you can move on to later parts of the video. I first heard about the Impact back in 2015 when it first made its appearance at IWA. And to be honest, I wasn't that interested in it. I had always had a thing for pretty wooden stocks and traditional form factors. But when I picked up an Impact for the first time at SHOT Show the following year, I quickly understood the hype. The Impact is a pre-charged pneumatic or PCP airgun, which means it operates using compressed air. It's a bullpup, which means the breech and barrel sit behind the trigger and grip, right below the cheek piece. And this means that you don't need to worry that much about barrel length. The form factor is very compact and utilitarian, and with the introduction of the Impact to the high-end PCP market, the rule book of what an airgun had to look like was quickly thrown out the window. The Impact has, over the years, gone through a number of different iterations, from the original to the Mark II to the Impact X to the M3, and countless small tweaks in between, like power upgrades and regulator improvements, etc. But what has actually made the Impact so successful? There's no doubt that it has improved since the first generation, and there are some definite steps forward with the M4, which we'll get to in a moment. But I'm going to make the argument in this video that the reason that the Impact has become so successful is that it hasn't changed that much. Soon after the Impact was launched, third-party accessories began to be developed by many different manufacturers. The reason that it was so easy to do this is that the Impact has always been like a Mechano set with all these little precisely engineered metal parts that can just be removed and bolted on. So it's easy to make parts for it. It's not like a wooden stock where you've got to physically drill into it to fit, let's say, a little Picatinny rail section. With this, you can simply design a part, 3D print a part, machine a part, whether it's the grip or the cheek piece or the top rail or the bottom rail, doesn't matter. You can take off the original, bolt on a new one, and you don't have to physically modify anything on the gun. Over the years, the sheer number of aftermarket parts and factory upgrades floating around have just grown and grown, and we're at the point now that you can build two different Impacts for different purposes that aren't even remotely similar to each other. And when a new version comes out, there's a really good chance that all those aftermarket parts that you've invested your hard-earned cash into can simply be removed from the old version and put on the new version. Case in point with the M4 that's in front of me here. Does this look familiar to you? You know that 100 foot-pound M3 that I've been blasting monkeys with for years? The one that I felt was basically perfect for that purpose? Well, all I did was take the barrel, the shroud, the silencer, the valve return spring, the hammer spring, the hammer weight, and the probe from the M3, fitted it into this gun, which took me maybe half an hour, and voila, it's shooting the exact same speed, exact same precision. I don't even need to change the profile on my ballistic app. It's got that same familiar feel to it. I don't need to relearn how to use it, but it has evolved. So that's what hasn't changed. Now let's get to what has changed. And it starts with the small things. Firstly, there are some stylistic changes. A few lines here and there, different knurling on the power wheel. I think they look good, but more importantly, I think that some of them do aid with accessibility. For example, the probe housing area now has a cutaway, so you can actually access that probe a little easier without having to remove the butt pad when you're working on the probe. Same thing with the trigger guard. There's an access slot at the bottom, so you can adjust all the set screws on the trigger without having to come in at weird angles which will damage your set screws, or removing the trigger guard entirely. The grip is new. For some people this may not be a big deal, but for me it is. I have pretty big hands, so I've always had to swap the factory grip out for something a little bit chunkier, but with the M4 there's absolutely no need to do that. In fact, I think I like this grip more than any of the aftermarket grips I've tried in the past, and that's saying something. The only thing I don't like is that the Sabre Tactical bag rider, which is my favorite bag rider, no longer fits in here. Thane and Vil, take a break from shooting everything that moves and go back to the workshop for just 5 minutes and go work on something, please. I'm waiting. The plenum is now 750 cc's instead of 720, so larger volume. How much of a practical difference does this make? Well, the only experience I have with this gun so far is shooting with this setup, and I can tell you that with the same barrel, the same hammer and valve return springs and everything, I can get to that same energy level as the M3, but I'm using 175 bar instead of 190 bar. So for my configuration, it has made a difference, but if you're shooting at much lower powers or with different ammo or different barrel length, I can't say for certain it may not have as much of an effect. You may have picked up that there is one less pressure gauge on the M4 when compared to the M3. Well, that's because the front reg has been removed. You may think this is a downgrade, but supposedly the regulator has been improved to the point where the dual reg system is no longer needed. Now, if you remember, the point of the dual reg system is to take pressure away or take strain away from the second reg, which is the main regulator. If you have a very large pressure differential, let's say you've got an aftermarket cylinder in the front that's 300 bar and your reg is at 80 bar for shooting light pellets, that's a lot of strain that gets put on the reg to try and keep that pressure. So the dual reg system, it would reduce the strain on the second reg by regulating your full pressure down to, let's say, 30 bar above the second reg pressure, and that made a difference. These new rigs are better. I can tell you that because I got to test one pretty early on in my M3. It was a brass reg piston and a few other small things, and that brass reg piston and the way that that worked meant that there wasn't reg creep even when there was a large pressure differential. With that being said though, I've always really never needed one because I've always used pretty high reg pressures. I'm not the kind of guy to go down to 80 bar and shoot light pellets most of the time. I'm trying to push the limits with heavy slugs. So I'm probably the wrong person to ask about the differences between the single reg versus the dual reg. I'll leave that to someone else. On my M3, you may also recall seeing a magnet sitting here behind the cocking lever. That was to hold the cocking lever in a rearward position when moving around with the bolt open and preventing accidental double loads. The M4 now has a ball detent in the back here, which basically does the same thing. When you pull it to the rear position, it clips into place. It's a tangible feeling and you cannot shake it forward, which is great. I also noticed that there were a couple magnets in here between the cocking block and this top rail. I believe that's just to make the cocking action a bit more snappy. When I push this back, it kind of snaps back and it hasn't got as much of a floppy feeling than previous versions. So that's a nice improvement. And now we get to the things that I do consider to be big upgrades. These are the things that justify the name change from M3 to M4 and may justify your decision to upgrade if it's something that you feel is worth it. And keep in mind that this is the same price as of right now as the M3. So that's kind of a big factor in this decision too. Number one is the top rail. We've seen some slight improvements over the years with a tilt introduced, but by and large, not much has changed since the first generation, until now. I have an M3 rail here just for comparison, but you can see the M4 rail is a couple slots longer on the pick rail. It's also adjustable. It can be slid forward and backwards, and this is great for three reasons. Number one, it solves the eye relief problem that bigger people had with previous generations. If your scope has a fairly long, generous eye relief and you're shouldering the scope and you're a big person with a long neck, you may need to slide your scope quite far forward. And if you don't have enough slots and you don't have enough space on the main body tube of the scope, that may be an issue, and you may have had to get an aftermarket butt pad that kind of allows you to increase your length of pull and increase your eye relief. You don't have to do that anymore. Number two, the extra Picatinny slots mean that you can have your scope rings further apart if you have a giant scope. And number three, the rail is always perfectly aligned with the barrel no matter what. And this is bigger than you think, because there was actually nothing wrong with the previous version, but if you weren't diligent when you tightened down these bolts, let's say your rail was a fraction of a millimeter skew and you tighten down these bolts, that fraction of a millimeter translates to a good few mils of windage downrange. And if you take up all your windage travel, you not only move the scope away from its optical center and reduce the image quality that you see, but you may also reduce your elevation travel depending on how your scope is set up. And so we saw a lot of issues with this, even with Element Optics, where a customer would say, hey, I'm running out of windage, there's something wrong with my scope. And it turns out they had a rail that just wasn't tightened down in a straight position. So this is just something that you had to be diligent with. I never had issues because I knew what I was looking for, but that's a thing of the past. This rail slides perfectly forward and backward. When you tighten it down, there's no room for it to move, so that problem is out the window. And lastly, let's talk about the send it button, the trigger. Trigger in past generations of Impact has more or less stayed the same, but this one is totally different. FX is calling this the quick set trigger. Please don't be an idiot like me and try to play around with it before reading the instructions, because it will quickly turn into the eternal frustration trigger. But in a nutshell, this is now a dual sear trigger mechanism that can be switched from an ultralight match trigger to a heavier hunting trigger just by moving the position of a set screw. I won't go into too much detail here because FX has made a really good video explaining how this works. I really recommend checking that out, but the big point here is that it has an adjustment range that exceeds anything else on the market. And if set properly, it can be far lighter than what was possible in earlier versions. I wasn't originally planning on doing an accuracy test. After all, we all know what the Impact can do already as far as precision is concerned. But I suppose I'll be crucified if I don't. So let's shoot some paper. Right, well, we've got some targets out at 100 meters or 109, 110 yards, and we're going to put some shots on paper just to show you what this gun's capable of. Obviously, don't read too much into all of this because you might be shooting different ammo, totally different speed, all that. But this is my hunting setup, and this is just showing you what my hunting setup is capable. Let's see what we can do. 100 meters. Wind's pushing a bit to the right. Yeah, very nice group aside from the one. Let's do another 5-shot group there. Yeah, that's nice. Go take a look. Well, there you go. I shot 2 just to show you what it's capable of. I think that first one was probably a bit of a gust pushing it to the right. Then it died down for the other 4. Those 4 are probably around 1 MOA, maybe slightly under. And then my second group, that's easily sub MOA at 110 yards. So yeah, very, very happy with that. And remember, this is my hunting gun. This is made to be light and compact. If I was to make this a bench gun, I would definitely want to switch out this front rail here and put a more beefy bipod on. This one's a little bit bouncy. And I definitely want to have a bag rider so I can get a firmer fit on the bag. But this is my lightweight hunting rig, and if that was a monkey, that would be basically in its face 10 times out of 10 there. So that's what we wanted to achieve, and this gun has done it. Very happy. Next, let's look at some numbers, and I'm just as curious as you here because, believe it or not, I've actually never shot a full string over the Crony at this power level. My expectations are to get about a full magazine, 28 shots, but let's see what happens. I'm using the FX True Ballistic and setting projectile weight to 40 grains. We'll just go ahead and fling some lead downrange. The Crony should pick up all the data. The results took me by surprise. We got 47 shots before we dropped below the reg and an SD of under 4 feet per second. I'm extremely happy with that considering that this gun is being pushed really hard to get as much power as possible. So the big question, is this worth the upgrade? And I think it really depends. If you're a hunter, you don't need that match trigger, your body size is right for the previous version of the top rail, then maybe not. The M3 is still streets ahead of anything else on the market in my opinion. It's still a great gun and it's by no means outdated. But if you're competitive like me and you're always looking for that edge, a lighter trigger, a few foot-pounds more energy, then yes, considering this is the same price as the M3, it is 100% worth considering. The beauty of the Impact though is that it can be literally whatever you want it to be. My compact M3 that I use to hunt monkeys at close range with that 5x30 scope on top is not going to be replaced by this M4. They are built for different purposes and both have their place. And if I want to swap components between the two and make the M4 the compact one and make the M3 the long range one, well, the parts are interchangeable, so I can do that. The Impact as a whole, I'm talking about the whole family of the Impact, is still the apex predator when it comes to hunting. I don't think there's anything on the market that can compete with it for its versatility and ability to make it exactly what you need for any hunting situation, and I don't think it's going to be dethroned anytime soon. Long live the king and rest in peace monkeys. I just had to say that.